Emma Lawson had never been the kind of woman who chased adventures. She was the kind of woman who showed up early, worked double shifts without complaining, came home at night with tired feet and a grateful heart. She lived in a small apartment on the north side of Chicago, just 2 bus stops away from the diner where she had worked for the past 6 years. The diner was called Rosie's, a warm little place with yellow walls and the smell of coffee that never fully left her hair no matter how many times she washed it. Emma did not mind. She had built her life around small comforts and quiet rhythms, and she had always told herself that was enough. But her 2 best friends, Priya Desai and Jenna Cole, had a different opinion about what enough looked like. Priya was the planner of the group, always researching destinations and printing out itineraries that nobody ever fully followed. Jenna was the one who made everything louder and more colorful, the kind of person who turned a grocery run into a 20-minute comedy show. Together, they had been pestering Emma for months about taking a trip, a real one. Not a weekend at Priya's cousin's house or a one-night stay at a motel near the lake, but an actual vacation, beaches, sunshine, somewhere. That was not Chicago in October. Emma finally said yes. Because she was too tired to keep saying no, they chose a small, coastal town in Florida called Pelican Cove. It was the kind of place that existed in postcards, with white sand beaches and palm trees that swayed like they had nowhere else to be. The 3 women arrived on a Friday evening, checked into their rented cottage, and immediately opened the windows to let the ocean air fill the rooms. Emma stood at the window for a long time, breathing it in, feeling something loosen inside her chest that she had not even realized was tight. The first 2 days were everything she had needed without knowing it. They walked along the shore in the mornings, ate fish tacos from a little wooden stand near the pier, and stayed up late playing cards on the porch. Emma laughed more in those 2 days than she had in the past several months combined. Jenna kept doing impressions of tourists they had spotted on the beach in Priya, and kept trying to photograph the sunset with her old camera that never quite captured what the eye could see. On the 3rd evening, Priya found out about a rooftop dinner at a nearby resort called the Pelican Grand. It was well above their usual budget, but Jenna insisted that they deserved one fancy night and split the cost before Emma could protest. They dressed up, which for Emma meant borrowing Priya's blue wrap dress and putting on the small pearl earrings her mother had given her years ago. She looked in the mirror before they left and felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. She felt pretty. The rooftop was breathtaking. String lights were strung between wooden beams, and the ocean stretched out endlessly beneath a sky turning every shade of orange and pink. The 3 women found a table near the railing and ordered something called the catch of the day, which turned out to be the best meal Emma had eaten in years. It was near the end of the evening when everything shifted. Emma had stepped away from the table to lean against the railing alone for a moment, just to feel the breeze and look at the water. She was not looking for conversation. She was not looking for anything at all. But then a man appeared at the railing a few feet away from her, also looking out at the ocean, also seemingly lost in thought. He was tall, with dark brown hair that the wind kept rearranging, and he wore a simple white shirt rolled at the sleeves. He looked like someone who did not need to try hard to look like he belonged anywhere. He noticed her looking at the water and said, without any introduction, that he always found the ocean made everything feel smaller and more manageable. Emma said she agreed. Though she had not spent much time near oceans in her life, that was the beginning. His name was Ryan Calloway. He did not mention that he owned the resort they were standing on. He did not mention that he had flown in from New York on a private plane that morning to check on several of his Florida investments. He simply talked to Emma like a person talking to another person, which was something she would only later understand was rare for someone in his position. They talked for a long time, about the way big cities felt, crowded even when you knew everyone in your neighborhood, about what it felt like to grow up watching your parents work without rest and wondering if that was just what life was supposed to be, about the strange quiet that comes right before something changes. Even when you cannot name what is about to change, Emma did not know why she talked to him the way she did. She was not usually that open with strangers. But something about the ocean air and the soft lights and the fact that she would never see him again made honesty feel safe. Priya and Jenna eventually found her. raised their eyebrows significantly at Ryan's presence, and then invented a reason to leave the two of them alone for a little longer. When the rooftop began clearing out, Ryan asked if she wanted to walk down to the beach. Emma said yes before she had fully decided to. They walked along the waterline for what felt like an hour. The moon was high, and the beach was nearly empty. Ryan took off his shoes and carried them, and Emma did the same. And they walked in the wet sand like two people who had nowhere they needed to be. He made her laugh 3 times. She said something about her mother's cooking that made him get quiet and thoughtful in a way that felt like respect. At one point, their hands brushed, and neither of them moved away. What happened that night was not planned by either of them. It was not reckless in the way that word usually sounds. It was quiet and warm and full of a kind of tenderness that Emma had not expected to find in a stranger on a beach in Florida. When the night ended, and the sun began suggesting itself on the horizon, Emma walked back to the cottage feeling like someone had opened a door she had forgotten existed. But when she woke up the next morning, Ryan was gone. He had left a handwritten note at the resort front desk, addressed simply to the woman in the blue dress, but the staff could not figure out who it was meant for, and Emma never received it. She flew back to Chicago on Sunday evening, with sand still in the bottom of her bag and a fullness in her chest she could not entirely explain. Then the weeks began, passing in one Tuesday morning. Standing in the narrow bathroom of her apartment before her early shift, Emma looked at the small plastic stick in her hand and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. 2 pink lines. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub and stayed there for a very long time. The morning light came through the frosted window and fell across the tile floor, and everything was completely still. She thought about the beach. She thought about the way he had looked at the ocean like it was something he respected. She thought about the fact that she did not have a last name, a phone number, or a single way to find the man who had walked barefoot with her under the moon and then disappeared before the sun came up. She was pregnant. She was alone. And somehow, underneath all the fear that was rising in her chest like cold water, there was something else. Something quieter and much harder to name. Something that felt, despite everything, like it might be the beginning of something rather than the end. Emma set the test on the edge of the sink, put her face in her hands, and took the longest breath of her life. Emma told Priya first. She called her on a Wednesday night, 3 days after the test, and said the words out loud for the first time. She was pregnant. Priya went completely silent for 4 full seconds, which was unusual because Priya was never silent about anything. Then she said she was coming over, and before Emma could argue, the call ended, and 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Priya sat with her on the couch for 3 hours that night. She did not fill the silence with false cheerfulness or pretend the situation was simple. She just stayed, which was exactly what Emma needed. Jenna came the following evening with food containers, stacked in a paper bag, and a determination to make Emma eat something warm. Between the two of them, Emma felt less like she was standing at the edge of a cliff and more like she was standing on uncertain ground with people holding her steady from both sides. But the nights were still hard. Emma lay awake. In the dark, thinking about a man she barely knew, she replayed every detail of that evening on the rooftop and on the beach. The way he had spoken about his childhood, the way he had listened to her, like what she said actually mattered. She wondered if she had imagined the warmth in him. She wondered if she was one of many women he had charmed on various beaches in various coastal towns. While traveling for business, the thought made her feel small and foolish, and she had to deliberately push it away before it could take root. She made her decision alone. On a quiet Sunday morning, with a cup of tea going cold on her kitchen table, she was going to keep the baby. She had not grown up wealthy. She had not grown up with everything she needed, but she had grown up loved, and she knew how to love. And she decided that was enough of a foundation to build something real on. She called her mother that afternoon and told her everything, Linda Lawson cried. Not from disappointment, from the fierce and immediate love that overtook her the moment she understood she was going to be a grandmother. She offered to come to Chicago. Emma told her she would manage, but that she would call every day. That seemed to satisfy Linda, at least temporarily. The weeks turned into months. Emma's body began to change. She let out the waistband on her work aprons, and her coworker, Tom Ridley, had worked at Rosie's even longer than she had. Started saving the corner booth for her during breaks so she could sit comfortably. Tom was a gentle man in his 50s, with a quiet sense of humor and a habit of leaving cups of chamomile tea on the counter near the register whenever he noticed. Emma looked worn out. He never asked too many questions. He just showed up, consistently and kindly, which Emma had come to understand was one of the rarest things a person could offer another. She was 5 months along when everything changed. Again, Rosie's diner had been struggling financially for the past year. The neighborhood was shifting, and foot traffic had dropped. Emma knew the owner, a kind older woman named Rosie herself, had been in quiet conversations with investors about the possibility of selling or restructuring. Emma had tried not to think about it too much because thinking about it meant thinking about losing the one stable thing left in her daily life. 1. Thursday morning in late March. A black car with tinted windows parked outside the diner. Emma noticed it from behind the counter because it looked completely out of place on their street. It's like a sentence that did not belong in the paragraph around it. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out and held the door open. And then another man stepped onto the sidewalk. Emma was refilling the sugar dispensers. At the counter, when she looked up, she nearly dropped the container in her hand. He was wearing a different shirt and his hair was shorter than she remembered, but everything else was exactly the same. The way he stood, the calm in his posture, the way his eyes moved across a room with a quiet kind of attention that most people never noticed until they were. Already being seen, Ryan Calloway walked into Rosie's diner and stopped moving when his eyes found Emma. The whole moment lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer than that. The noise of the diner, the coffee machine, the couple arguing softly near the window, all of it seemed to dim. Emma stood behind the counter with a sugar dispenser in her hand and a stomach that now made the truth of everything completely visible. And Ryan stood at the entrance of the diner with an expression moving across his face that she could not immediately read. Scott Harmon! His assistant stepped forward to introduce them professionally, but Ryan raised one hand slightly, and Scott went quiet. Ryan walked to the counter. He looked at Emma. He looked at her stomach. He looked back at her face. He said her name like a question. Softly and carefully, Emma set down the sugar dispenser and said, "Hello." It turned out that Ryan Calloway was the investor who had been in quiet conversations with Rosie about purchasing and renovating the diner as part of a small hospitality expansion project he was running in several Midwest cities. He had not known Emma worked there. He had not even known her last name until Scott had emailed him the employee list the previous week, and Ryan had seen the name Emma Lawson and had spent 3 days telling himself. It was almost certainly a coincidence. It was not a coincidence they spoke privately in Rosie's small back office that afternoon. Emma sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and told him the truth in plain language, because she had never been the kind of person who wrapped difficult things in soft packaging. She told him about the test, about the decision she had made, about the months of uncertainty and the nights of lying awake, wondering about a man whose last name she had not even known. Ryan listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had thought about that night more times than he could count. He said he had asked the resort staff if they knew anything about the 3 women who had dined on the rooftop that evening, and that he had left a note that apparently never reached her. He said he had not stopped thinking about the conversation they had at the water's edge, or the way she had talked about her life with a kind of honesty that most people spent their entire lives avoiding. Emma asked him why any of that mattered now. Ryan said it mattered because she mattered. Not the situation, not the responsibility. Emma did not cry. She had made a rule for herself about not crying in situations where she needed to think clearly, but she felt something shift inside her chest, the same loosening she had felt when she first opened the cottage window in Pelican Cove and breathed in the ocean air. She told him she did not need rescuing. She was very clear about that. She had a job. She had friends. She had a mother who was already knitting tiny yellow blankets. She had made a decision she stood behind completely. Ryan said he understood. Then he said he was not offering rescue. He was asking for a chance to be present. They agreed to start slowly. There were no dramatic declarations and no immediate promises. Ryan began coming to Chicago regularly, not to manage the situation, but simply to spend time with Emma. They went on walks along the lakefront. They found a small restaurant near her apartment that had good soup and bad lighting, and they both agreed it was perfect. He went with her to a doctor's appointment. When she asked if he wanted to, and he stood in the examination, roomed with his hands in his pockets, and went very still when he heard the heartbeat. For the first time, Dr. Patricia Moore, a warm and thorough woman who had been Emma's physician for 4 years, noticed the careful way Ryan positioned himself in the room. Close enough to be present, but far enough not to crowd Emma's space. After he stepped out to take a call, she told Emma that whoever that man was, he was paying attention. Emma said she was starting to notice that too. Ryan told Emma about his past on a cold April evening when they were sitting on her couch after dinner with the television on, but neither of them watching it. He told her about a woman he had been engaged to several years earlier. A woman who had been drawn to his ambition, but had grown frightened of his emotional distance and eventually left. He had buried himself further into work after that and had stopped expecting his personal life to feel like anything meaningful. He had everything and somehow nothing at the same time. And he had become so accustomed to that equation that he had stopped questioning it, until one evening on a rooftop in Florida when a woman in a blue dress looked out at the ocean and said something honest. Emma listened to all of it and then said that she understood what it felt like to be so inside. Your own routine that you forgot to look up? She said she had been looking down at her feet for so long that she had almost missed the entire sky. Ryan looked at her for a long moment, and then said quietly that he was very glad she had looked up when she did. Outside the apartment window, Chicago was still cold and gray, but inside something was becoming warm. May arrived slowly, the way spring always arrived in Chicago in fits and starts. A warm afternoon followed by a cold morning, flowers appearing on one block while another still looked like February. Emma was 7 months along, and she had begun to feel the particular tiredness that comes not from overwork, but from carrying something precious and being aware of it every moment. Ryan had quietly arranged for Rosie's to stay open under the new ownership structure, with all existing staff retained, including Emma, with the option of a lighter schedule during her final months. Emma had almost refused on principle, but Rosie herself had called her and said to please stop being stubborn and take the adjusted hours. Emma had laughed despite herself and agreed. Ryan came to Chicago every week now, sometimes for 2 days, sometimes for 3. He and Emma had fallen into a rhythm that felt natural without either of them having tried to engineer it. He would arrive on Thursday evenings, and they would cook dinner together in her small kitchen, which was something that surprised them both because Ryan had spent the previous decade eating in restaurants, and Emma had assumed a man like him would not know what to do with a cutting board. It turned out he could make exactly 3 things well: pasta, scrambled eggs, and a roasted chicken that he insisted required very specific timing. Emma taught him how to make her mother's lentil soup, and he took notes on his phone with a seriousness that made her laugh until her side ached. They were careful with each other. There was a tenderness in the way they navigated their growing closeness, an awareness that what was building between them was real and therefore worth being careful with. Ryan did not push for declarations. Emma did not pretend she felt less than she did. They were 2 people learning each other in the way that only happens when both people decide that honesty is worth the discomfort. And then Diane Calloway arrived. Ryan's mother was a tall, immaculately dressed woman from a Connecticut family that had been wealthy for 3 generations. She had opinions about everything and expressed them with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. Ryan had mentioned her carefully, which Emma had understood to mean complicated. She had not expected Diane to appear at her apartment door on a Saturday afternoon in May, with Scott nervously hovering behind her on the landing. Emma answered the door in a loose green sweater and her hair up. and Diane looked at her with an expression that was not cruel, but was absolutely evaluating. She came inside. She sat down. She accepted the tea Emma offered because refusing it would have been impolite, and Diane Calloway was not impolite. She was simply precise. She told Emma that she understood the situation and that she bore her no personal ill will. Then she said in a tone that was carefully measured that Ryan had built his life in a very particular way and that she hoped Emma understood the difference between the world Ryan occupied and the world she was accustomed to. She said it gently. She said it as though she were doing Emma a favor. Emma set her own cup of tea down on the table and looked at Diane Calloway for a moment without speaking. Then she said that she had grown up in a house where there was not always enough money for new shoes, but there was always enough love for everyone who came through the door. She said she had worked every day of her adult life without apology and without asking anyone to carry what she could carry herself. She said she was not intimidated by wealth, and she was not impressed by it either. And that the only thing she had ever asked of Ryan was that he be honest and present, which he had been. She said all of this calmly and without raising her voice. Diane studied her for a long moment. Then something in her expression shifted very slightly, in a direction that Emma could not immediately name, but that felt like recalculation. Diane left an hour later without having said anything more about the difference in their worlds. Ryan called that evening. Emma told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long moment, and then said he was sorry, and that he would speak to his mother. Emma told him it was already handled. He asked if she was sure. She said she was absolutely sure, and that he should stop worrying and go finish the work he had been doing when she called. He said he loved her. It came out simply, without build-up, in the middle of a regular sentence, the way true things sometimes arrive. Emma was quiet for just a moment. Then she said she loved him too. Also simply. Also without ceremony. They stayed on the phone for another hour, saying nothing particularly important. 3 weeks later, Diane Calloway appeared again. This time she called ahead and asked Emma if she might come for tea. She arrived with a small wrapped package that turned out to contain a soft, white blanket with delicate stitching along the edges. She said her own mother had given her one like it when Ryan was born. She did not make a speech about it. She just set it on the table and asked Emma how she was feeling. It was not a transformation. Diane was still Diane, but it was something, and Emma accepted it as something. The baby came on a Tuesday night in June, 6 days before the due date. With the kind of urgency that babies arrive with when they have decided they are ready, regardless of anyone else's schedule. Emma called Priya first, who arrived at the hospital within 20 minutes with her hair still damp from the shower. Jenna arrived 12 minutes after that, somehow fully dressed and carrying a paper bag of snacks for the waiting room. Linda Lawson flew in from Ohio and was there by midnight. Ryan was in New York when Emma called. He was in the middle of a meeting with 12 people in a glass conference room on the 42nd floor of a building that costs more per year to maintain than most people earned in a lifetime. He picked up on the second ring. When Emma said it was time, he ended the meeting without explanation, left the building, and was in the air within the hour. He arrived at the hospital at 2 a.m, still in his work clothes, and walked directly to the room where Emma was. He took her hand, and she held it without saying anything about the fact they had crossed 2 states in the middle of the night on a Tuesday. Their daughter was born at 4:17 in the morning. She was small and loud and absolutely perfect in the way that new humans are perfect. All raw and unfinished and full of an astonishing amount of life. The nurses placed her in Ryan's arms while the doctors attended to Emma, and Emma watched from where she lay and saw. Something happened to Ryan's face that she would never forget for the rest of her life. He was not a CEO in that moment. He was not a billionaire or a businessman or the man who had walked into a rooftop restaurant in Florida, looking composed and certain of himself. He was just a person holding his daughter for the first time. The expression on his face was one of total and complete undoing. His eyes went bright and his jaw trembled, and he held the baby like she was the most important thing he had ever been trusted with, which she was. He looked up at Emma and said thank you in a voice that barely made it out. Emma said she was fairly sure they were both responsible for this one. He laughed and then cried again and then laughed once more, and Emma thought that this was probably her favorite version of him. They named her Rose after the diner, where everything had accidentally come together. The weeks after the birth were messy and wonderful and exhausting in ways that language only partially covers. Ryan restructured his schedule significantly, moving more of his operations to Chicago, setting up a smaller office downtown, and being home by 6 most evenings in a way that his New York colleagues found genuinely baffling. He changed diapers with the same focused attention he gave to boardroom decisions. He learned the exact way Rose needed to be held when she could not sleep, which was over his left shoulder with one hand, supporting her back, and the other moving in slow circles. A technique Emma had discovered at 3 in the morning and shared with him like it was classified information. Linda came to visit for 2 weeks and quietly took over the cooking, which no one argued with because Linda's cooking was an experience that elevated the entire apartment. Priya organized a meal delivery schedule among Emma's friends that ran like clockwork for the first month. Jenna showed up 3 times a week and handled whatever needed handling while Emma slept, which was the most generous gift anyone could have given. Diane came once, holding Rose with an expression Emma recognized as love, even through the careful composure that Diane wore the way other people wore jewelry. She stayed for dinner. She told Linda the lentil soup was remarkable. Linda told her the recipe was Emma's, and Diane looked at Emma across the table with something that might, if you were paying close attention, have been pride. On a Sunday in September, when Rose was nearly 3 months old, Ryan told Emma he wanted to take a trip. Emma asked where. He said Florida. She looked at him for a moment. Then she understood. They flew down on a Friday. Priya and Jenna watched Rose, which involved approximately 47 text updates over 24 hours that Emma read with great affection. They stayed at the Pelican Grand and ate on the rooftop where the string lights were still strung between the same wooden beams, and the ocean was still the same shade of deep and endless blue.
After dinner, Ryan led her down to the beach. They took their shoes off the way they had the first time and walked in the wet sand, and the moon was high and it felt like walking back into a memory, except that everything was completely different because everything had changed. Ryan stopped walking and turned to face her. He was not nervous. Emma had expected him to be nervous because that was how these moments were supposed to work, but Ryan was steady and certain in the way he was about everything. He decided completely. He told her that he had spent most of his life building things. Companies, buildings, portfolios, structures that existed in the world and could be measured and valued. He said he had been good at building things and had never quite understood why it left him feeling hollow at the end of the day. Then he told her that what she had given him was the first thing he had ever been part of that he could not build or buy or plan. It had simply arrived, the way the best things do, without permission and without warning, on a beach at the end of an evening neither of them had expected to matter. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and took out a ring that was simple and beautiful in the way that things are when someone has thought very carefully about the person they are choosing it for. He said he was not asking her out of obligation or logic or the practical mathematics of shared parenthood. He was asking because he wanted to spend every ordinary Tuesday and every difficult year and every quiet night for the rest of his life with her specifically. He asked her to marry him. Emma stood in the wet sand with the ocean behind her and the moon above and looked at this man who had walked into her life twice, once on a rooftop in Florida and once through the door of a small diner in Chicago, and she thought about every terrifying and tender and unexpected thing that had happened in between. She said yes. He put the ring on her finger and she put both her arms around him and they stood on the beach for a long time without saying anything else, because sometimes the right ending is simply knowing that the story is not ending at all. It is only becoming something larger. Back in Chicago, in a small apartment that now had a crib in the corner of the bedroom and yellow blankets folded on the chair and the smell of Linda's lentil soup still faintly in the walls, Rose was sleeping. She was small and warm and entirely unaware that her parents were standing on a beach in Florida where everything had once begun, beginning it all again, better this time, with their eyes open and their hands held and the whole long beautiful future stretching out in front of them like an ocean with no visible end.